We've already explored how messy both the transmission and the history of translation of the sacred texts found in our Bibles today has been. There are no clean lines, really, and there's no easy answers. Many of us don't like to hear this. We would rather there be clearer evidence, firmer categories, and really, if we were honest, less faith required. But for those of us in that camp, I don't really have any comforting news. As we continue to dig into the collection of ancient texts and what it means to us today, things will only become a little less clear and less firm. And if you really seek meaning from the sacred texts, it'll require more faith, which, as we'll see in the end, might be the point. The next bit of the messiness we must explore is how some texts were chosen to be included and some were not. We saw in earlier videos that the history of the Old Testament and the New Testament, that there have been, and sometimes continues to be, differences of opinion on what is in and what is out among the various Christian sects. This process is usually referred to as canonization. The word canon comes from Greek origins, and it meant a rule or something which other things are measured by. And early Christians used this word to refer to the process of deciding which Christian texts were chosen as authoritative and which were not. Many argue that the concept itself, before Christians used the word canon, really belonged to the Jewish people, as they were the ones that were first to grapple with choosing which texts from their history and culture were authoritative for Jewish faith and life, and which were not. There has been a tradition for millennia that the Hebrew scriptural canon was settled after the remnant of Israel came back to their land from Babylonian exile. Even some modern scholars put a really weighty influence on both the period of the Babylonian exile and the return to Israel just after in the collection, editing, and even the writing of the bulk of the Hebrew Canon. This tradition would like to affirm that the canon of what we now call the Old Testament was set in stone by the 4th century BC, and maybe even earlier in the 5th century BC. The evidence that we have, though, really kind of points us away from this tradition and to something a bit more complicated. The earliest mentions of a text treated as authoritative occur within the scriptural narrative itself. A public reading was made of what was called the Law of Moses, both before the Babylonian exile occurred by King Josiah, who had implemented many reforms in the southern kingdom of Judah, and then again by Ezra at the return of the exiles to Jerusalem after they had rebuilt the altar and the temple and the walls around the city. We don't know exactly what this text was, but many believe it to be the first 5 books of the Bible attributed to Moses. Some believe that Josiah's reforms were actually the catalyst to a rewriting of Moses' books, which led to the formation of what we now call the Book of Deuteronomy. And it would explain many of the differences between that text's account of the law and the story of Moses versus the other 4 in the Torah. The apocryphal book of Sirach includes a list of historical figures. These historical figures are mentioned in his letter in order that they appear in the Hebrew canon we have today. Many have inferred from this that it means that by the 2nd century BC, when the author of Sirach was writing, that there was an awareness of a Jewish canon much like the one we have today. Early Jewish historians such as Philo and Josephus also included lists of the Hebrew scriptures which largely align with the later Masoretic texts, but it's really hard to tell if these parts of their writings were original to them or if they may have been added at a later date once the canon was a bit more settled on. Early Christian writers can also give us a good view of what texts were considered canon by Jewish communities in their day. Melito, a Jewish-born Christian bishop in Asia Minor at the end of the 2nd century, provides us with a look at what he considered to be the authoritative Old Testament. He was even the first person that we're aware of who even used the term Old Testament and the Old Covenant in contrast to the New Covenant. His Old Testament contains all the books of the modern Protestant Bibles today, with the exclusion of the book of Esther. And he doesn't include any of the apocryphal books that were found in the Septuagint in his list. It is thought that he created his list after visiting Palestine and researching which books the Jewish communities of his day believed to be the most authoritative. The other early canon we see comes from the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that we've looked at, known as the Septuagint. This collection included the texts that we have today, plus the apocryphal books included in various Christian Bibles. The Septuagint canon stands against the later canon formed by the Masoretes at the end of the first millennia AD. The Reformation cast doubt on the authority of this earlier Greek canon of the Hebrew Scriptures because it had included texts which the Hebrew-speaking tradition did not include. But the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls near Qumran has caused more questions to rise about which texts in the first century Jewish communities were accepted as authoritative. Among the different scrolls that were found there in Qumran, some were Hebrew or even Aramaic versions of the Greek texts that we have in the Apocrypha, and others were there in Greek, showing that they may have had earlier and more widespread support than we had previously believed. By the end of the first millennia AD, the Hebrew canon was set by the Masoretes. They believed they were following an accurate tradition from the people of Israel that had been held for over 1,000 years. There was no council or moment where a list was created and deemed to be authoritative, but the lists and codexes found from that time of the Masoretes all agree. The Old Testaments seem to have come together over time as the Jewish people lived with and learned from ancient texts being passed down. Some found greater favor and created a more unified understanding of the God of Israel, and so those stuck around. Others seemed to fade over time as they became less relevant. The Jewish people of Jesus' day clearly had a set of texts which they considered authoritative. We know this from the evidence we just examined and from how often the Gospels mentioned the law and the prophets, as well as quote from texts that we have in today's Hebrew Canon. It's interesting, they don't quote from any of the apocryphal texts. An often overlooked concept in Jesus' day is the importance of commentary on those ancient texts. Those ancient texts were not considered to be understood in a vacuum. Hundreds of years of Jewish study and teaching informed how the Jewish people of Jesus' day and how Jewish people today interpret and apply those texts. These commentaries became cornerstones to Jewish teaching by the first century, and they grew over the succeeding centuries to give us insight into what ancient Jewish communities believed about their text. We'll get to those commentaries, those texts, more in a later video. For now, it's enough to say that though we do not know what was considered canon in Jesus' day from the Old Testament perspective, the belief that God had inspired certain texts and that they were authoritative for teaching about God was a commonplace belief.